B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, April 7th, 2020. The acting Navy Secretary, who gave a misguided speech to the crew of the USS Teddy Roosevelt, had to eat his words and now has resigned. So you've heard of this guy in recent days. Thomas Modley is the acting Navy Secretary. And, Trump likes to leave posts vacant or put people in there on an acting basis because it makes it easier for him to call the tune and make them dance. So in a moment, you will hear some of his remarks to the crew of the aircraft carrier Roosevelt that Modley made just a couple of days ago. And one of the key points that he made was that he picked on Brett Crozier, the captain who was dismissed last week after a memo leaked that he had sent to the Pentagon, demanding action to protect his crew as the coronavirus was spreading through his ship with a crew of some 5,000 men and women. So he called Brett Crozier stupid, mostly because the memo leaked. And he said that Crozier was either naive or stupid if he thought that it wasn't going to leak because he sent it to some 20 people. But consider just how stupid, and I can't call it naive in the case of Modley, it was to go to the ship, give a speech where he slammed Crozier, even while admitting that he was beloved by his crew, and essentially alienated the crew by considering their affection to be misplaced and not up to Navy rigor. So last night, Crozier had to eat those words under order, presumably, from the Secretary of Defense, who is scared shitless of Trump. His name is Mark Esper, the SecDef. And so the apology reads like this. Let me be clear. I do not think Captain Brett Crozier is naive or stupid. I think and always believed him to be the opposite. We pick our carrier commanding officers with great care. Crozier is smart and passionate. I believe precisely because he is not naive and stupid that he sent his alarming email with the intention of getting it into the public domain in an effort to draw public attention to the situation on his ship. I apologize for any confusion this choice of words may have caused. Well, now I'd like you to listen to part of his commentary, and you'll hear the choice of words, which is very Trumpian. And I imagine that he hoped that this wouldn't leak to the public, but that it would come to the attention of the bully-in-chief and might lead to his being nominated full-time for the Secretary of the Navy post. Here in his own words.
I've been wanting to come out to the ship since we first found out you had COVID cases on here. I was actually planning on being here last Tuesday after I went to see the Mercy off in Los Angeles. So I want you to know that no one at my level has been ignoring the situation here from the very beginning. I reached out to your CO through my chief of staff very, very early on in this crisis. On Sunday, I told him that I wanted to come out to the ship and if it would be okay or if it would be too disruptive. I told him that because I wanted to be able to help if there was anything else he needed as this massive effort was underway to get you guys healthy and clean and safe. He waved me off. He said he felt like things were under control. He had been concerned a day or so before that things weren't moving quickly, but he still wanted to get more beds, but he didn't think it was necessary.
Blame the victim.
He also talked to my chief of staff and emailed back and forth with him. On Sunday night, he sent that email. And that email went out to a broad audience of people. I know that I mentioned that it was over 20. We believe it was forwarded to even far more than that. he was picked up by the San Francisco Chronicle, which published sensitive information about the material condition of a naval warship.
And a little bit later, I don't think we'll get to it in this excerpt, but Modley tells them that leaking to the media is the paramount crime because the media has an agenda, because the media wants to embarrass the Navy and the crew and, of course, Trump. It is just so Trumpian to use that kind of dodge, deflection, and the idea that we are victims of a liberal media.
If he didn't think, it was my opinion, that if he didn't think that information was going to get out into the public in this information age that we live in, then he was A, too naive or too stupid to be the commanding officer of a ship like this.
What the fuck?
The alternate is that he did it on purpose. And that's a serious violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which you are all familiar with. That message and all the contents in that message was perfectly fine for him to send to people in his chain of command in a confidential way so they could get acting on it. He, in fact, could have given it directly to me through my chief of staff or to me, as I asked him to do when I first reached out to him on the ship, when we first found out that there were COVID cases here. It was a betrayal of trust with me, with his chain of command, with you, with the 800 to 1,000 people who are your shipmates on shore right now, busting their asses every day to do what they need to do, to convert what they do in a normal day, to get you guys off of here, get you safe, get you healthy, get you clean.
So he poses as this magnanimous leader who was betrayed by the action of Captain Crozier. At another point, he called him a martyr CO who betrayed his crew. And this is flatly disgusting. And as I've said before, I didn't serve in the military. I'm not a big military booster. I support the people who serve. But the mission is often so perverse that I am, far from any diehard supporter of our military organizations. But with that said, this is a kind of command by intimidation that spreads beyond the military and infects the entire Trump administration. And as we'll get to in our next story, the revenge that Trump wields for those who he perceives as insufficiently loyal or people who are willing to embarrass him by revealing the truth is a very dangerous leap toward totalitarianism. Trump does identify with dictators. And as he defied the Congress over the attempted impeachment and has asserted that he can do anything he wants, it is double dangerous because of his defective personality, the narcissism, the ego, the vanity, the demand for 100% or 110% loyalty. And let me just mention, if you have not yet heard my latest interview with Dr. Justin Frank, the paywall is lifted, it's unrestricted, and I strongly encourage you listen to his latest arm's length analysis of our dear tweeter. So there was a predictable expression of outrage, including from some Republicans who had served in previous administrations. And just about 20 minutes before I sat down to record today's podcast, I learned the news that Modley has resigned. Now, I like the fact that he did so and so quickly. But Captain Crozier deserves a full investigation. And it's kind of a tease and dangerous to assume what Trump's intention is, but he said, maybe I'll look into it at yesterday's grandstanding briefing in the press room. So as you know, there's been a struggle over who will lead the Inspector General team to monitor the $2.2 trillion bailout and stimulus package, the CARES Act, that was rammed through the Congress very quickly. And Trump has now upended the panel of federal watchdogs to oversee that. And it gets a little complicated because the new law permits only current inspectors general to fill the new position. And they managed to use that to ace out Glenn Fine. And he has a kind of uneven history as an inspector general, both at the Justice Department, and he is currently the acting Pentagon watchdog. And because he's only acting, he doesn't meet the criteria they are saying. And so the IG from the EPA is going to be moved into that position after we were told that two different lower-level staffers from the White House were being considered by Trump for an appointment. But that requires Senate confirmation, and maybe he had second thoughts. Now, this follows the Friday night massacre of Michael Atkinson, the IG who was running the Pentagon shop, and he handled the whistleblower report that ultimately led to Trump's impeachment. Then yesterday, the Health and Human Services Inspector General, whose name Trump did not even know before he expressed suspicion that she's some kind of an Obama holdover who's out to get him. Well, her name is Christy Grimm, with two M's, like the brothers Grimm. And she didn't write any fairy tale. She did an investigation that brought together information from 300 sources under HHS across the country and issued a report that described widespread testing delays and supply issues at the nation's hospitals. And the fearful orange comb-over, he immediately leapt to the conclusion that she was some sort of an operator out to get him. He tweeted another fake dossier. And as I mentioned, he didn't even know her name. He was demanding that reporters immediately cough up her name when he couldn't summon it, even after he questioned her motives. And it turns out that Christy Grimm has been an inspector general since 1999. She started under the later days of the Bill Clinton administration. She survived the Bush administration. She served in the Obama administration. But his reflexive thought, that this was an Obama appointee who was going to get him. And here's a little bit of balls. Michael Horowitz, the current Inspector General of the Justice Department, oversees the Council of Inspectors General. He has defended Atkinson for handling the whistleblower matter appropriately and defended his brothers and sisters in the IG club. So this is getting more and more dangerous. If we believe that we have a republic, if we can keep it, it's not truly a democracy. But by defying the Constitution in the impeachment process, by stonewalling efforts by the Congress to conduct appropriate oversight, he is right in front of our eyes, adopting dictatorial stances and asserting certain dictatorial powers, and he wields them in a series of personal vendettas, revenge. So there's been a growing controversy about Trump's repeated peddling, I called it snake oil yesterday, of a drug that has not been fully tested as a treatment for COVID-19 And by now we all know the name hydroxychloroquine. And I learned today that it has an acronym that's a much easier way to use it or describe it. That's HCQ. Well, there is a report that Donald Trump, quote, has a small personal financial interest in a French drug maker called Sanofi. They make Plaquenil, Plaquenil, the brand name version of HCQ. Now, the New York Times buried this in a story about the controversy. And to be fair, because Trump has been so aggressive in preventing public disclosure, starting with his tax returns, then with his business holdings, which he has refused to put in a blind trust or otherwise distance himself from. Well, they say that his personal interest is somewhere between $100 and $1,500. You say, well, that's pocket change for an alleged billionaire. But the three family trusts that operate holding some of the Trump family interests, as of last year, each had investments in a mutual fund whose largest holding was, Sanofi. We also have learned that Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who slept through the transition meeting where the Obama team explained the risk of a pandemic, well, Wilbur also has ties to the drug maker, and we don't know the extent. But these oligarchs, they are operating with impunity. And it certainly explains at least some of Trump's unethical and improper touting of this medication. Now, in recognition of the controversy, I want to present some views for a minute here that don't really jibe with mine. And they come from a man I respect, NYU professor Mark Crispin Miller. He's critical of many narratives. And he begins a lengthy email for an excellent demonstration of how not to be a journalist. Watch this unhinged attack by CNN's John Berman on Peter Navarro, White House trade advisor, for having the audacity to disagree with Dr. Fauci on the wisdom of treating COVID-19 patients with HCQ. So he links to a YouTube video of the CNN interview conducted by Berman of Navarro, who is speaking from the White House lawn. And I watched it, and I disagree with Professor Miller. I think that Berman was aggressive. He did interrupt the monologues and the kind of filibuster that Navarro was launching. And in particular, he challenged the credentials of the trade advisor who has been central to the misguided trade war and all of the tariffs that have been imposed on trade with China. And I am predisposed to dislike Peter Navarro. Don't get too comfortable with that, because after this, the next story actually shows some foresight by Navarro. But Navarro is an economist. He calls himself a social scientist, and he has a PhD. So he says, hey, there's Dr. Fauci and there's Dr. Navarro. And to his credit, Berman aggressively pursued, even at the point of interrupting Navarro, and got him to agree that a trade advisor shouldn't be offering medical advice. And as we reported yesterday, there was this argument in the Situation Room Saturday before Trump went on television and touted the drug. And Navarro presented what he called a second opinion to Dr. Fauci. Now, I don't put Fauci on a throne, but I think he is about the only sane and nonpartisan voice that we hear from the White House. Dr. Deborah Birx tries to edge into commentary that conflicts with Trump's, but she always kisses his ass. So back to Miller's email here. To say that Berman was biased rather understates the virulence with which he badgered, insulted, interrupted, and misquoted Navarro. acting less like a reporter than like a Merck propagandist, which, of course, is what he is. Now, I don't understand that reference. I looked up the history of John Berman, and I don't see that he's ever worked for a pharmaceutical company, much less a specific one like Merck. So I don't know where that comes from, but I don't embrace it. So later he says, the narrative that pervades the liberal media, whose warlike partiality to Fauci's view has left their audience trembling in the dark. Let's start by noting that there's been a near-total blackout on the FDA's approval of HCQ for off-label use. That measure announced a week ago has been reported only by Fox News and the New York Post, while the Times and all the other liberal media have simply blacked it out. All right, fair enough. That's news to me. And I have argued that compassionate use for patients who request HCQ is something I don't object to if they go into it knowing the risks. So, Mark Crispin Miller continues, the New York Times has been especially careful to avoid reporting the FDA's revised position. April 2nd, 3 days after the FDA released the fact sheet announcing its new position, the Times ran a teeny item at the bottom of page A6. Now, I have to acknowledge that most days I look at the Times homepage online. I get home delivery on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and that's when I have the opportunity to look at everything that is in the paper. And it is frustrating because often stories that I think are important either are never on the homepage or, have come and gone at the time that I examine the Times website. Back to Mark Crispin Miller. The day after imperceptibly reporting that the new Wuhan study, the Times ran, touting cure brings simple country doctor, cheers and doubts. And I did read that. It was in the Saturday paper, and it is a profile of Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, who has a practice in a village in New York State, with a Hasidic population. And so he says that he has successfully treated patients with HCQ, azithromycin, and zinc sulfate to, quote, cure hundreds of COVID-19 patients. Here's the village. It's called Krias Joel. And Miller argues, rather than use that story to suggest that maybe there is something to the promise of HCQ after all, the Times reporters just follow orders, use every grounds to cast the doctor's story as a parable. Now, I do agree the Times will often profile people as a way to dismiss them. And I will concede that I didn't read that story with a deep focus. I thought of it as more like a feature story. Back to Mark Crispin Miller. All that poison tripe from our free press is based squarely not on science but on propaganda, especially Dr. Fauci's lie, which he repeats hypnotically, that there have been no proper scientific study of HCQ to treat COVID-19, that all the claims of its success are purely anecdotal. Well, here we get into an area that reaches beyond the limits of my qualification, because I honestly I don't have the science background to second-guess Fauci, but I trust him, as I said, more than anybody else who is front and center in addressing the pandemic. So, Miller continues, on February 20th, the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents published the results of an open-label, non-randomized clinical trial of HCQ in the treatment of COVID-19 patients, the work of 18 specialists headed by Didier Raoult. And the French wouldn't pronounce that T. I just wanted you to be able to spell it. The eminent French specialist whom Macron's government has been vigorously smearing in deference to Big Pharma, as is much of our free press. And he notes that Dr. Raoult is not only a far more prolific researcher than Fauci, but one whose latest research could obstruct Big Pharma's plans, explaining why our free press reversed the latter and either slanders or blacks out the former. That would be the French doctor. And he concludes, so the evidence that this drug shows effectiveness against the virus isn't anecdotal after all, which means that Fauci can't be trusted, and neither can the Western press that treats him as a sage, and not an instrument of the huge industry that owns them all. That danger is severe, and one that we can only overcome by breaking out of house arrest and gathering again as soon as possible. So I think it's thought-provoking. As you've heard, I don't agree with Professor Miller on every one of his arguments, but I share it with you because I don't consider myself to be the arbiter of the truth. And one more note, in that interview with the CNN reporter John Harmon, it was fascinating to hear Peter Navarro argue for choice. He said the use of HCQ is between the doctor and the patient, right? And that is the fundamental argument of the pro-choice movement and those who continue to support Roe versus Wade, that it's a matter of choice, and it is between a woman and her doctor. It's quite contradictory of the Republican line. He also noted, which does not address the efficacy or safety of HCQ, that all New York hospitals have it. And without evidence, he said that many doctors and nurses are taking it in a prophylactic way to try to prevent the incursion of the coronavirus. So now we turn momentarily to praise Peter Navarro, because it turns out at the very end of January, he wrote a memo shared across the West Wing of the White House, writing, the lack of immune protection or an existing cure or vaccine would leave Americans defenseless in the case of a full-blown coronavirus outbreak on U.S. soil. This lack of protection elevates the risk of the coronavirus evolving into a full-blown pandemic, imperiling the lives of millions of Americans. Again, January 29th. When Trump was in full denial and deflection mode, oh, we got one case, oh, we got 15. Well, they're all getting well, so maybe it's 14. And Trump continued that stance in various ways until the middle of March. Did he receive or read Peter Navarro's memo? Well, if it was longer than a page and had a long word like hydroxychloroquine in it, chances are that our cartoon president, who we know doesn't read a damn thing, might have missed it. There was a second memo. This one in February. I don't have the exact, February 23rd from Navarro. This is not a time for penny pinching or horse trading on Capitol Hill. And when Trump Co. asked for only $2.5 billion, Navarro would have been relieved to see that the Congress said, well, that's not enough. And they authorized $8 billion, which we know is not enough. And one more pull from Navarro's, one of the memos, I think this is the first one. Regardless of whether the coronavirus proves to be a pandemic-level outbreak, there are certain costs associated with engaging in policies to contain and mitigate the spread of the disease. The most readily available option to contain the spread of the outbreak is to issue a travel ban to and from the source of the outbreak, namely mainland China. Well, that's what Trump picked up on because it fits his anti-immigration build-a-wall mentality. But he seemed to ignore or dismiss the central alert that was in the papers from Peter Navarro. Well, today, after a really chaotic sequence of events, if you listened yesterday, I reported that the Democratic governor, the vacillating Tony Evers in Wisconsin, had finally issued an order to delay the primary election because of the risk of spreading the virus. Well, in short order, the Republicans who dominate, not just control, but dominate the Wisconsin State Supreme Court ruled no fucking way. The election continues. And then the federal Supreme Court, at least the majority the white guys, at least the majority, the all-male cast of conservatives, they turned around and overruled the federal judge in Wisconsin who said the limits of his authority were to extend the date for mail-in ballots to be received. And so this was a 1-2 punch to preserve voter suppression in Wisconsin. And one of the underlying issues is there's another hardline conservative who is up for election to the court, and I hate elected courts myself. And they didn't want to delay the opportunity or risk that the Democratic opponent might beat him. And so over the howls of complaint from many elected officials, and there are many, many anecdotes of people who will not be going to the polls today because they asked for but did not receive an absentee ballot. And Wisconsin has this history of voter suppression that led to Trump being declared the winner in 2016 by 21,000 votes, I believe is the number. This is so ugly. And it is an abuse of what remains of our electoral system, which is hardly transparent and hardly one person, one vote. At the Supreme Court, the majority issued a 10-page opinion that was unsigned. And they said, oh, no, this is not partisan. This is just a very narrow technical issue. And the dissent came from the aging female voice on the court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she said Wisconsin voters who have not already cast absentee ballots will have to brave the polls, endangering their own and others' safety, or they will lose their right to vote through no fault of their own. Ginsburg, ever polite, said, while I do not doubt the good faith of my colleagues, the court's order will result in massive disenfranchisement. And the slippage continues. And get this, as I say, The Guardian from London often has better investigative and enterprise reporting on these United States than the corporate media and even the local outlets in this country. And I feel free to criticize them when they fail us, like the report yesterday about the chemical weapons report that has been massaged to support the notion that the Syrian government was responsible for any and all uses of chemical agents in the bloody civil war there. But I digress. The Guardian has it right today. Approximately 232,000 Wisconsin voters are on a list from a program called ERIC. And it's your traditional voter caging scheme where you send a postcard to a voter, and if it doesn't come back, boom, they are unregistered. And in an anecdote here, The Guardian cites a woman who has been living in the same location for over 10 years. She votes every time, and suddenly she has been unregistered. So she happens to be African American, and she is not alone. A Guardian analysis has found voters in zip codes that are predominantly black or heavily populated by students are nearly twice as likely to be flagged for removal. These populations are also more likely to vote for Democratic candidates. Here's today's COVID-19 news summary, ably prepared by Linda Lewis. The Grizzly scoreboard, worldwide 1.365 million cases confirmed, 76,500 deaths. Here in the U.S., the confirmed cases, which remain undercounted because of the lack of testing, are just under 370,000, with 11,000 plus deaths. These are according to the data collection at Johns Hopkins University. 3,485 deaths in New York City alone. Boris Johnson remains in intensive care, and they're telling us not to expect another update until sometime on Wednesday. That does not bode well, in my opinion. Linda calls it cautious optimism from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx at the Monday briefing. We see potential to go under the numbers projected by the models. If enough Americans in enough places continue to stay home, avoid large groups, wash their hands, and take the other measures, the pandemic may prove less lethal than feared. Now, it's attributed to Birx. And let me just say that I'm very uncomfortable with some of the cautious optimism and what I consider to be happy talk. Because in California, whatever the peak is, and I do believe that our stay-at-home measures have reduced the spread of the virus, but the peak is not expected for another 2 or 3 weeks, according to our public officials here. We also have the prediction of new hotspots, Colorado, the District of Columbia, and I can't recall the other states that I mentioned yesterday. So they trotted out the guy Brett Giroir. He's an admiral who claims that 1.79 million tests have been done. And he was optimistic we've been able to easily meet all the ventilator requests from the state. And when asked, Giroir, or is it Giroir, said, we have in stockpiles, what we have is not a number we give out. And then Trump just said, oh, it's 9,000. He simply cannot control themselves. At Monday's briefing, Trump demanded flattery from reporters, repeatedly attacked those who asked questions concerning supply shortages. He insisted that he and the administration get credit for what he called a successful response and attacked reporters for not being sufficiently complimentary. All those nasty questions. And what really pissed him off was what I referenced in the Inspector General comments reporting just a few minutes ago. So Christy Grimm and her team, between March 23rd and 27th, contacted more than 300 hospitals across 46 states. I think that's a pretty adequate study. It found hospitals facing testing shortages, longer than usual wait times for test results, shortages at key hospitals corroborated in previous press reports from New York and elsewhere. And when pushed on the fact that the report came from his own administration, Trump suggested the findings were politically motivated, as we detailed a few minutes ago. And continuing his deflection of any questions about the small business loan programs, there are 2 of them, that are included in the CARES Act. And I've been, I think, balanced that it's hard to get a memo on a Thursday and start opening the loan window on Friday. But it's been a badly fumbled implementation. But Trump is in full denial. No, nothing wrong there. It's all beautiful. Asked about the possibility of restrictions on travel between hotspots in the United States, he said, well, there's also testing done when people get onto those planes and also when people get off the planes. But there's no evidence that plane passengers in the U.S. are being tested or screened, temperatures taken. While it might be happening sporadically, we don't see any effort to offer some consistent type of screening or even testing of people who are still flying. The military has relented and will allow COVID-19 patients to be treated on the Mercy and the Comfort. The Comfort's in New York, the Mercy in Los Angeles. And Trump has hammered India to pump out more HCQ. And we'll get to in a moment, President Modi, in a measured response, said that hard-hit nations around the world will be shipped supplies of this drug of dubious value. Trump continues to use the briefings as a platform for talking about other issues. We just signed a trade deal, he said. It's the biggest deal probably ever made. Trump said China is now going to spend billions of dollars on U.S. agriculture and other products. And a quick recap of the hotspots. New York said a record 731 New Yorkers died in the city in the past day. 138,000 have now contracted the virus. After dipping for 2 days, the death tally, rose to the highest one-day number since the state started battling the crisis. Here in California, we confirmed another 1,200 cases. The death toll rose to 387. But by rate of growth, it was California's best day since the outbreak was in its infancy. And we have clarified that the 500 ventilators that California shipped to the stockpile, the federal stockpile, are on loan. And I am relieved to hear that because those terms were not described yesterday. But despite the expressed needs of New York City by Governor Cuomo, Mike Pence has decided that they'll be split up between Nevada, Maryland, Delaware, the District of Columbia, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam. And Guam, of course, is where the crew of the Roosevelt is facing the spread of the virus. Here's another disturbing set of data, at least to date. Data on race and those who are dying from the coronavirus shows that in Louisiana, about 70% of the people who have died are African American. In the county around Milwaukee, where 27% of residents are black, nearly twice as many have tested positive for the virus. In Chicago, where African American residents make up just under a third of the population, more than half of those found to have the virus are black, and 72% of those who are dying inside the city are African American. I also saw a headline at the Detroit Free Press the other day that 40% so far of those dying in Michigan are African American. And we can speculate about underlying health issues, lack of health insurance, lack of access to medical care or early intervention. But it is a stunning figure. Brad Sherman is a California congressman from Sherman Oaks in the San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles area. And he is prone to some stunts. I've known Brad since he was a state-level official here in California. We conspired to shame the legislature into repealing the snack tax. That was around 1992, as I recall. So I've known this guy for a while. He's the one who hammered the automakers when they came to Washington for a bailout. And he said, "Raise your hand. Who flew here commercial?" And no hands went up. But today, he set an example. In a procedural maneuver in the House, he had the gavel, and he wore a face mask. China, after 10 weeks of lockdown in Wuhan, has announced that the regulations will be lifted. Wednesday's reopening came after only 3 new coronavirus cases were reported in the city in the last 3 weeks. Now, while that is encouraging, I do share the concerns of our intelligence community that China has been underplaying the impact of the virus. And they tell us nearly 94% of businesses have resumed operations. Major industrial enterprises have resumed operations at the 97% level. Again, those figures seem pretty rosy to me. As I mentioned, President Modi in India has indicated that he will be shipping HCQ drugs to a number of countries, and the language would include the United States. Again, I think that's a mixed bag. In Austria, the hardline chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, announced yesterday a timetable for the country to reemerge from lockdown that would see some stores reopen after Easter, just like Trump dreamed. Austria's had 220 deaths, but they believe their peak occurred on March 26th. In Italy, officials are weighing the idea of widespread testing for antibodies that would allow some workers to return to work. In Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel warned that it would be irresponsible to discuss a date for easing measures there. Steve Mnuchin's got his hand out again, asking Congress for another $250 billion. It seems they underestimated the demand for the small business loan packages. There are two versions of it. Ammon Bundy has returned to visibility. He is the guy originally from Nevada. They staged a protest over grazing fees. Then they had the 41-day occupation in Oregon of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge that I covered in some detail. Well, Ammon has showed up in Idaho, where he is adopting the mantra of New Hampshire, live free or die. He said that it was a constitutional right to peacefully assemble. He wants to create a network of people ready to come to the aid of those facing closure of their businesses. Quote, if it gets bad enough and our rights are infringed upon enough, we can physically stand in defense in whatever way we need to. It's those Second Amendment remedies that they love to talk about. And also, practitioners of religion are saying that they want the right to go to church even if it kills them. And I saw a bizarre comment on CNN last night where they poked a microphone in the car of a woman who was leaving a church service where hundreds have gathered. I think it was in Ohio. And when they asked her if she had put people, including herself, at risk, she said, no, I am bathed in the blood of Jesus. Are these people hoping for rapture? Good commentary over at The Guardian today from Arwa Madawi. Opening this way, Natalie Portman once described Jared Kushner, a former classmate at Harvard, as a supervillain. And Madawi says, while the president's son-in-law is certainly a joker, he lacks the charisma needed for supervillain status. Indeed, he lacks any charisma whatsoever. He has the presence of a piece of plywood. Then she notes how Trump trotted him out last week at the grandstanding press briefing. She writes, all of a sudden it was glaringly obvious how dangerous Kushner's hubris is. I, for one, became even more fearful when I saw how inept Kushner is, said Meghan McCain. And Madawi says McCain's fears are widely shared when he claimed that it's supposed to be our stockpile. And one more quote. During his 39 years on Earth, Kushner has continuously failed upward. Despite being an unremarkable student, he got a place at Harvard. According to spokespeople for Kushner Companies, this was unrelated to his dad giving $2.5 million to the university. After buying a skyscraper at 666 Park Avenue, I think that's where it is, at the very top of the real estate market, Kushner was miraculously bailed out by a company with links to the government of Qatar. After, of course, he tried to shop his White House influence to others who turned him down. Wherever Kushner is, questionable deals, questionable ethics, and a crowd of yes men seem to follow. And one of the muckrakers who I respect, Lee Fung, writing at The Intercept, notes that Jared Kushner's family real estate company, which owns and manages thousands of apartment units, continues its aggressive eviction practices and debt collection lawsuits as Americans wait for government relief. 15 tenants in New Jersey and Maryland have been on the receiving end of lawsuits, even after both states declared states of emergency and put a hold on evictions. The Maryland and New Jersey moratoria do not prevent debt collectors from filing new lawsuits, and he offers examples. And as Trump daily praises and plugs corporate America and individual CEOs who he says are doing the right thing, a report dated April 2nd from ProPublica notes that the Trump Organization has not contributed a dime or even free golf balls to anybody so far. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the PBC podcast with your subscriptions. People like Jeff Ratner, Clifford Johnson, Susan Gavet, and Carl Howard. And as I mentioned yesterday, I think tomorrow I'll put together the details, but I am planning to chip in my $1,200 check, if it ever arrives, from the government, to help people who are part of this podcast community. And again, I will offer the details. I'm going to offer small grants to people who are struggling to buy groceries. And I'm going to invite you, instead of donating money to me for the next 30 days, to contribute to the Collins Podcast Community Fund. And we'll see if we can help out some people in need at this time. Well, Trump has picked a new press secretary, replacing Stephanie Grisham. She was there for 9 months. She followed Huckabee Sanders, who followed Scott, the dancing fool. I can't even remember the idiot's name now. Anyway, he has picked another pretty blonde. I'm sure he gave her a 10. And her name is Kayleigh McEnany. And she briefly was the anchor of a White House propaganda effort that was fed to Facebook every day. She joined the re-election campaign, and she's one of those people who delivers talking points with barbs. We can't wait to see her in action. The Trump administration has identified a neo-Nazi organization, and they're cracking down on it. Only problem is, it's in Russia. It's called the Russian Imperial Movement. Now, this may lay to rest claims that Trump is Putin's bitch, but it also shows that they are unable to identify, even though they've been exposed in broad daylight, the array of neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups that continue to operate and poison right here in the good old U.S. of A. This is a little disturbing news, and because I'm not an expert on Ecuador's politics, I can only share my suspicion. But Rafael Correa, best known to many of our listeners as the one who gave shelter, asylum to Julian Assange at that country's embassy in London, has been convicted of corruption charges and may face 8 years in prison. Now, he's currently, I believe, living in Belgium, so it doesn't appear that he is at risk of immediate arrest. But this smells like a stinky deal. And we know that his successor and one-time ally, Lenin Moreno, made some sort of a deal with the United States to end the asylum protection for Assange at that London embassy. And I speculate that this prosecution and conviction may be a part of that package. And finally today, I'm happy to report that about 11 months ago, there was a significant breach of journalistic protections by the San Francisco Police Department. And the context is the public defender, Jeff Adachi, had died under somewhat suspicious circumstances. He was with a woman who was not his wife. And Brian Carmody, who is an independent reporter who routinely investigates things and then sells his services to local TV stations and newspapers, he got a hold of the police report, which raised serious questions about the manner of the investigation into Adachi's death that was underway. And when cops came to his home, where he works from, with a battering ram, forced their entry, held him at bay in handcuffs for several hours as they rifled through his computers and his files. It was a really dark moment for freedom of the press in ultra-liberal San Francisco. And the city of San Francisco has agreed to pay him $369,000 for violating his rights. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place, even with Tom Modley. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.